Something has shifted, and most people can feel it even if they can't explain it. There's a pressure in the air now, like the walls are slowly moving inward, and it didn't happen overnight. Systems that people depended on without thinking are suddenly changing how they work, what they allow, and who gets a voice. Rules appear without debate, updates roll out without consent, and explanations come only after the damage is done. This isn't chaos, it's coordination. And the most dangerous part is that it's being sold as normal, necessary, even helpful. You're told it's for safety, for stability, for your own good. But notice something important. Force isn't being used. No one is marching down the streets. No tanks, no obvious dictators. Instead, access is quietly adjusted. Visibility is reduced. Reach is limited. Accounts disappear. Financial tools pause. And suddenly people realize their entire lives run through systems they don't control. That's when panic sets in. Not because something dramatic happened, but because something silent did. What we're witnessing right now is a shift away from freedom as a principle and toward permission as a condition. You're still allowed to speak technically. You're still allowed to participate technically, but only within invisible boundaries that can change at any moment. Say the wrong thing, share the wrong idea, question the wrong assumption, and the system doesn't argue with you. It simply removes frictionless access. No confrontation, no explanation, just disappearance. This is why people feel exhausted, confused, and angry without knowing exactly why. They sense the rules are no longer stable. What was acceptable yesterday is questionable today. What was celebrated last year is flagged this year, and instead of open debate, there's silence, a silence enforced, not by law alone, but by dependency. When your work, your money, your voice, and your social existence all pass through the same narrow digital gates, control doesn't need to shout. It just needs to close quietly. And here's the key point most people miss. This isn't being done because people are dangerous. It's being done because independent thinking is unpredictable. Systems can manage behavior far more easily when opinions fall within a narrow, approved range. Diversity of thought sounds good in theory, but it's chaos for centralized control. So the solution isn't persuasion anymore, it's filtration. Decide what people see, decide what spreads, decide what fades away. Over time, perception adjusts, resistance weakens, and people begin policing themselves. That's the real moment we're in right now. Not a collapse, but a transition. Not open tyranny, but managed reality. And if this feels unsettling, it should. Because once control stops looking like control and starts looking like convenience, most people don't resist it. They adapt to it. And adaptation, when guided quietly enough, becomes acceptance before anyone realizes what's been lost.
To really grasp what is unfolding, you have to move beyond events and start looking at patterns, because events are just the surface expression of something much deeper. Throughout history, power has never relied solely on force for very long. Force creates resistance, and resistance creates instability. The most effective form of control has always been psychological, shaping how people perceive reality so that they willingly accept limits without recognizing them as limits at all. When perception is managed, behavior follows naturally, and when behavior becomes predictable, control becomes effortless. This is why the focus has shifted away from overt authority and toward influence, narrative, and normalization. People are not being dragged into submission. They are being gently guided into agreement, step by step, until the destination feels familiar rather than imposed. What most people experience as sudden change is usually the result of long-term conditioning. Ideas that would have been rejected outright years ago are introduced gradually, framed as progress, convenience, or protection. Each step is small enough to avoid alarm, yet significant enough to move the boundary of what is considered acceptable. Over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the unacceptable becomes unremarkable. This is not accidental. It is how perception is trained. Once people internalize a framework of this is just how things are now, questioning feels pointless, even dangerous, because it threatens their sense of stability and belonging. The education system, the media, and social structures all play a role in reinforcing this perceptual framework. From an early age, individuals are taught not how to think, but what to think within approved limits. Information is presented as neutral while being carefully curated, and repetition gives it the weight of truth. When everyone around you shares the same assumptions, those assumptions stop being questioned. They become invisible, like the air you breathe. And anything that challenges them triggers discomfort, ridicule, or hostility, not because it's been disproven, but because it disrupts the mental structure people rely on to make sense of the world. This is why so many people defend systems that restrict them. Their identity has become entangled with the narrative those systems provide. To question the system feels like questioning themselves, their past choices, their sense of certainty. It's far easier psychologically to dismiss alternative perspectives than to confront the possibility that reality is not what they were told it was. Control, in this sense, no longer needs enforcers, it recruits defenders. People become the gatekeepers of their own limitations, policing thoughts and speech, not because they're forced to, but because they've been conditioned to believe it's necessary. When you understand this, the current moment becomes clearer. What we're witnessing is not a sudden loss of freedom, but the culmination of a long process of perceptual narrowing. Options still exist, but they're increasingly framed as unrealistic, irresponsible, or dangerous. The range of acceptable thought contracts quietly, and most people adjust without noticing. Yet the moment you step outside that range, even gently, the reaction reveals how tightly perception has been managed. And that reaction tells you everything you need to know about where real power now resides. Not in laws alone, but in the minds that have learned to accept them without question.
Here's where things start to get uncomfortable, because once you see this, you can't unsee it. Independent voices don't disappear by accident. They fade out in patterns. One day they're everywhere. The next day their reach collapses, their visibility drops, their audience can't find them anymore, and no clear explanation is ever given. It's always vague. Guidelines, policy updates, community standards, words that sound reasonable but explain nothing. And that's intentional, because when rules are unclear, people don't know how to challenge them. They just know they're suddenly on the wrong side of something they didn't vote on and never agreed to. What's happening isn't a crackdown, it's filtration. Information is being sorted, ranked, slowed down, or buried before most people ever see it. You're not told something is forbidden, you're simply never shown it. And that's far more effective, because outrage fades when people don't even know there's something to be outraged about. Silence replaces debate, absence replaces argument, and the system stays clean while shaping the narrative without resistance. This is how control evolves in a digital world. Not by banning everything, but by deciding what spreads and what doesn't. Notice how the language has changed. It's no longer about truth versus lies. It's about approved versus unapproved, about what's responsible to say, about what might make someone uncomfortable. The standard keeps shifting, always tighter, always narrower, and people adjust because they're afraid of being excluded, flagged, or erased. When your livelihood, reputation, or social existence depends on staying visible, self-censorship becomes survival. You don't need someone to silence you, you do it yourself. And here's the real trick. This system creates the illusion of choice. Millions of voices still exist, but they're funneled through the same narrow channels, operating under the same invisible constraints. It feels like freedom because there's noise everywhere, but the range of acceptable conclusions keeps shrinking. Everyone argues, but only within boundaries that never threaten the structure itself. That's why nothing fundamentally changes, no matter how loud the debates get. The system doesn't care about disagreement. It cares about direction. This is also why people turn on each other. When pressure increases, the system redirects frustration sideways. Instead of questioning who set the rules, people attack those who step outside them, label them dangerous, call them irresponsible, demand their removal. And suddenly censorship doesn't look like control. It looks like morality, like protection, like progress. The crowd becomes the enforcement mechanism, and authority steps back, invisible and untouched. If this sounds extreme, ask yourself a simple question. When was the last time an unpopular idea was debated openly instead of quietly buried? When was the last time someone was challenged with logic instead of removed with a policy? That shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in while people were distracted, divided, and exhausted. And now we're at a point where silence feels safer than speaking and conformity feels easier than thinking. That's not an accident. That's the system working exactly as designed, not to control everyone loudly, but to manage perception quietly until resistance feels pointless.
When you step far enough back from the noise of daily events, a much clearer picture begins to emerge, because what we're witnessing now is not new. It's a modern expression of an ancient strategy. Control has always followed the same trajectory. Decentralization to centralization, diversity to uniformity, choice to compliance. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. Power accumulates, narratives solidify, and perception narrows. And crucially, this process works best when people believe it's happening naturally, or worse, that it's happening for their benefit. The reason this strategy is so effective is because human beings don't experience reality directly. They experience it through interpretation. What you perceive shapes how you behave, and how you behave shapes the world you live in. If perception can be guided, behavior becomes predictable. And once behavior is predictable, systems can be designed around it with extraordinary efficiency. This is why control no longer relies primarily on physical enforcement. It relies on expectation, on conditioning people to anticipate consequences before they ever act, on teaching them subtly and repeatedly where the invisible lines are. Over time, these lines stop feeling external, they become internal. People begin to filter their own thoughts before expressing them. They pre-edit opinions, soften language, avoid questions, not because someone is standing over them, but because the risk feels too great. Social rejection, professional consequences, loss of access, these are powerful deterrents, especially in a world where identity and survival are increasingly tied to participation in centralized systems. The result is a population that appears free on the surface, but is deeply constrained at the perceptual level. This is where the illusion of consensus becomes critical. When the same perspectives are echoed across institutions, media, and social structures, they take on an air of inevitability. Alternatives begin to feel fringe, unrealistic, or even dangerous. Not because they've been disproven, but because they've been excluded from the conversation. Silence becomes a form of erasure. And once something is erased from awareness, it no longer needs to be defeated. It simply ceases to exist in the public mind. What makes the current moment particularly significant is the scale and speed at which this process is unfolding. Technology has allowed for a level of narrative coordination that was previously impossible. Information can be filtered, ranked, and shaped in real time, influencing perception before critical thinking even has a chance to engage. This doesn't require conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It requires alignment of incentives. Systems optimize for control because control produces stability, predictability, and profit. And anything that disrupts that balance is treated as noise to be reduced. Understanding this isn't about fear, it's about clarity. When you recognize that perception is the primary battleground, you stop reacting emotionally to surface level events and start observing the deeper structure beneath them. You begin to see how consent is manufactured, how boundaries are normalized, and how people are guided into accepting limitations they would have rejected outright in another context. And once you see that pattern, the question is no longer who is right, but why is this the only story being told? Because the moment you ask that question, perception begins to expand. And expansion is the one thing centralized control cannot tolerate.
This is where the pressure really starts to show, because once systems reach a certain level of control, they can't afford unpredictability anymore. Unpredictable people ask questions. Unpredictable people don't follow scripts. And unpredictable people disrupt systems that rely on compliance disguised as choice. So instead of convincing everyone, the strategy becomes simpler. Isolate the outliers, drown them out, and make examples quietly enough that most people get the message without being told. Fear doesn't need to be announced. It just needs to be demonstrated once or twice. You can see it in how quickly people retreat when consequences appear. One account vanishes, one career stalls, one voice is suddenly labeled problematic, and thousands of others immediately adjust their behavior. They don't ask what happened, they ask how to avoid the same fate. That's how obedience spreads without orders. The system doesn't have to chase dissent. Dissent learns to hide. And once it hides, it loses the power to connect, organize, or challenge anything meaningfully. What's dangerous about this phase is that it creates an artificial sense of consensus. When opposing viewpoints are filtered out, it looks like everyone agrees. That illusion becomes self-reinforcing. People assume they're alone in their doubts, so they stay silent. Silence then gets interpreted as agreement, which justifies tighter control, and the cycle accelerates. At that point, the system isn't responding to public demand, it's manufacturing it. This is also when language becomes a weapon. Words are redefined, softened, or made deliberately vague. Concepts like safety, harm, and responsibility are stretched until they can mean almost anything. That flexibility allows enforcement without clarity. If the rules can change at any moment, people are forced to constantly self-monitor. You're not punished for breaking a rule, you're punished for failing to anticipate one. That uncertainty keeps everyone off balance and easier to manage. And here's the part no one wants to admit. Most people participate in this willingly. Once they feel threatened enough, they enforce norms on each other. They shame, report, and exclude, not because they're evil, but because they're afraid. Fear turns ordinary people into extensions of the system. Authority doesn't need to be everywhere when the crowd does the work for it. Division becomes a feature, not a bug, because a population fighting itself never looks up to see who's benefiting. By the time people realize what's happening, the structure is already in place. The pathways for dissent are gone, the alternatives have been marginalized, and the idea of pushing back feels unrealistic or even dangerous. And that's the moment control becomes stable, not because everyone agrees, but because enough people are afraid to disagree. The system doesn't need loyalty, it needs silence. And silence, once normalized, is one of the hardest things to break.
At this stage, the most important thing to understand is why so many intelligent, well-meaning people not only accept these conditions, but actively defend them. The answer lies not in ignorance, but in psychology. Human beings seek certainty, belonging, and meaning, especially in times of rapid change. When the world feels unstable, people gravitate toward narratives that offer clarity and reassurance, even if those narratives come with hidden constraints. Once a belief system provides emotional safety, it becomes part of identity. And identity is something people will protect fiercely, often more fiercely than truth itself. This is how conditioning moves from the external to the internal. What begins as guidance becomes expectation, and expectation becomes self-regulation. People learn, often unconsciously, which thoughts are rewarded and which are punished, which opinions lead to acceptance and which lead to isolation. Over time, this creates a mental filter that operates automatically. Ideas are evaluated not on whether they are true or false, but on whether they are safe to express. And when safety replaces truth as the primary measure, perception contracts dramatically. Social pressure plays a critical role in this process. Humans are social creatures. Exclusion triggers deep psychological discomfort. When dissent is framed as irresponsible, dangerous, or morally suspect, most people instinctively distance themselves from it. Not because they've examined it and rejected it, but because association alone feels risky. This is why ridicule is often more effective than argument. Mockery shuts down curiosity. Labels replace discussion. And once a label sticks, the content itself no longer needs to be addressed. What's particularly effective about this system is that it creates the illusion of choice and agency. People believe they are thinking freely because no one is openly commanding them, yet the range of acceptable conclusions has already been decided. You're free to choose as long as you choose within the boundaries. And because those boundaries are rarely stated explicitly, most people never realize they exist. They simply feel a vague sense of unease when approaching certain topics and instinctively pull back. This leads to a profound narrowing of human potential. Creativity diminishes, curiosity fades, and critical thinking becomes conditional. Questions that once drove progress are now treated as disruptions. Over time, society becomes less resilient, less adaptable, and more dependent on centralized authority to define reality. And the more dependent people become, the more threatening independence appears. Freedom begins to look like chaos, while control is mistaken for stability. Recognizing this dynamic is not about blaming individuals, it's about understanding the environment they're operating within. When perception is shaped continuously from childhood through education, media, and social reinforcement, deviation feels unnatural. Yet, history shows that every major shift in human understanding began with individuals willing to step outside the accepted framework and tolerate discomfort. Expansion of awareness has always been unsettling because it dissolves certainty. But without that discomfort, perception stagnates. The critical question then is not whether people are right or wrong, but whether they are free to explore ideas without fear. Because the moment exploration becomes dangerous, perception stops evolving. And when perception stops evolving, control becomes absolute, not through force, but through agreement. Quiet, normalized, and rarely questioned. That is the real danger of this moment, and also its opportunity, because once you see how perception is shaped, you also begin to see how it can be reclaimed.
This is the point where denial becomes impossible, because once systems reach this level of integration, you start seeing the same pattern everywhere you look. Different names, different industries, same outcome. Technology that was sold as optional becomes unavoidable. Platforms that promise connection become gatekeepers. Tools that were meant to empower individuals quietly turn into filters that decide who matters and who doesn't. And the moment you try to step outside of that structure, you realize how few alternatives actually exist. That's not coincidence, that's consolidation. What's happening now isn't about one law, one platform, or one policy. It's about dependency. When everything from communication to income to visibility runs through centralized systems, resistance becomes expensive. Not illegal, just costly. You're free to opt out, technically, but the consequences make that choice unrealistic for most people. And that's how control wins without force. It doesn't need to lock you in. It just makes leaving too painful. You can see it in how fast people adapt to restrictions they would have rejected years ago. New rules drop, and after a brief moment of outrage, life goes on. Not because people agree, but because they're tired, overloaded, distracted. When pressure is constant, resistance feels exhausting. And exhaustion is one of the most effective tools of control. A tired population doesn't organize. It copes, it scrolls, it adjusts expectations downward and calls it realism. This is also where fear gets weaponized in subtler ways. Not fear of violence, but fear of instability, fear of losing access, fear of being cut off, fear of standing alone. And that fear doesn't need to be shouted. It's baked into the system. People watch what happens to those who push too hard, speak too clearly, or refuse to play along, and they learn the lesson without a word being spoken. That's efficient. That's scalable. And that's exactly why it works. The most dangerous part is that this system doesn't look oppressive to those inside it. It looks orderly, managed, responsible. Any disruption is framed as a threat to stability. Anyone who questions too much is labeled reckless. And over time, people begin to associate conformity with safety and dissent with danger. Once that association is established, control becomes self-sustaining. The system doesn't need to silence everyone. It just needs to make silence feel like the smart option. And here's the reality check. None of this requires everyone to agree. It only requires enough people to comply and enough others to stay quiet. History shows that's a very low threshold. Once that line is crossed, change no longer comes from public debate. It comes from permission granted by systems that were never designed to be questioned. At that point, freedom isn't taken away dramatically. It erodes quietly, disguises progress, efficiency, and inevitability. If this feels heavy, it should. Because this is the moment where awareness either sharpens or shuts down. You can feel when something isn't right, even if you don't have all the words yet. And the danger isn't that people are being controlled, it's that they're being trained to accept it as normal. That's the final stage before control stops needing justification at all.
At the end of all of this, the most important realization is not about systems, technology, or authority, it's about perception. Everything described so far only works if people remain unaware of how their sense of reality is being shaped. The moment you see that perception is not fixed, that it is learned, reinforced, and continuously adjusted, a quiet shift takes place. You stop reacting purely emotionally to events and begin observing them instead. You notice patterns rather than headlines. You recognize repetition rather than coincidence. And in doing so, you begin to step outside the narrow frame that has been presented as the limits of possibility. What truly threatens centralized control is not rebellion, outrage, or even exposure, it is awareness. Awareness dissolves fear because it replaces confusion with understanding. When people realize that much of what they've accepted was conditioned rather than chosen, the spell begins to weaken. This doesn't mean rejecting everything or believing anything blindly. It means holding ideas lightly and questioning them honestly. Control thrives on certainty, on rigid belief, unquestioned assumptions, and emotional attachment to narratives. An open mind is difficult to steer because it does not anchor itself to a single version of reality. This is why the expansion of perception has always been discouraged, not through outright bans alone, but through ridicule, marginalization, and social pressure. Curiosity is framed as naivety. Questioning is framed as danger. And certainty is rewarded as maturity. Yet history repeatedly shows that progress real progress, comes from those willing to tolerate uncertainty long enough to explore beyond it. Every meaningful shift in human understanding began as an uncomfortable question that didn't fit the accepted worldview of its time. The choice facing people now is subtle but profound. It is not about picking sides or adopting new labels. It is about reclaiming the ability to observe without immediately judging, to listen without instantly rejecting, and to think without fear of consequences. When perception expands, behavior changes naturally. And when behavior changes across enough individuals, society shifts not through force, but through awareness spreading quietly, person by person. This is not a call to panic or confrontation. Panic collapses perception, it narrows focus, and hands control back to whatever promises relief. Clarity does the opposite. It creates space. It allows people to see options where none seemed to exist before. And once you realize that many of the limits you've lived within were never physical, but perceptual, the idea of inevitability begins to dissolve. Ultimately, the most powerful act available to anyone is not resistance, but understanding. Understanding how narratives are formed, understanding how fear is used, understanding how identity becomes attached to belief. Because once you understand those mechanisms, they lose their grip. You no longer need permission to think, because thinking itself has been reclaimed. And in a world increasingly shaped by managed perception, that quiet act of awareness may be the most radical form of freedom left.